Genesis.
Back to Genesis.
I'm going to go through it.
Just start all over.
We're going to do an overview. We're going to kind of quickly cover the last chapters, 34 to 50. It's going to take a couple of weeks, I think. I thought I could get it done in a day, but yeah, that doesn't work for me. So we're going to pick it up, and we'll go through and kind of hit the highlights, and then we'll move on to the book of Genesis, or to Revelation. I hope everybody's okay with going to Revelation.
Yes.
You know, we kind of made a command level decision there. But, all right, Genesis 34:23. I guess I should have put that up there too. We left off in chapter 34, and this is where the Shechem, the son of the ruler of the city of Shechem, had raped Dinah, the daughter of Jacob. And then the brothers, her two brothers, told the men that if they'd get circumcised, then they could marry Dinah, because Shechem really wants to marry Dinah. And if all the men will get... So I think that would have been my question if I was the men going, now wait a minute. Only Shechem wants to marry her. You know, why do all the rest of us have to get involved in this thing? But that's what they told them so that they could then become one people. That was the idea they were selling, but they were lying. They had an ulterior plan in place. And look at Genesis 34:23. It's part of the sales pitch, as I call it, that Shechem made in order to convince. Because I mean, to this day, I don't really know how he convinced these guys to do this. You know, these are grown men, and yet he does it by appealing to their greed. Because remember, Jacob and his family, they have enormous wealth. And they see all that wealth and say, hey, if we become one people, then we'll get all that eventually. So this is what he says. Will not their livestock, their property, and all their beasts be ours? Only let us agree with them, and they will dwell with us. Now remember also, God told them, you don't mix with the people of Canaan. You don't marry them, And later on, they're going to be called to destroy all the people in Canaan. And yet, here they're acting like they're going to become part of this group of people at Shechem. And so his sales pitch is, they are at peace with us, afraid that if they don't, because of his actions, they might go to war. And so they will trade with us. We can marry their daughters. We'll get their livestock, their property, their beasts. In fact, all will become ours. And that's what he used to convince these men to all get circumcised. And in actuality, all he's doing is he's sentencing them to death, because that's what the brothers are going to do. They're going to kill all these men. And that's what they do. They get all the men to become circumcised, and then they wait, and then Simeon and Levi waited until the third day. That's Dinah's direct brothers, Simeon and Levi. And by themselves, these two guys, they go into the city of Shechem and they kill all the men, all of them, because they can't get up and fight, And so they kill every single one of them, and because of what they did to Dinah. But as you recall, they really weren't that concerned about Dinah. They were more concerned about the fact that they did something to them as a people. They shamed us, that kind of thing. They were more concerned about that than what happened to poor Dinah. So now, when the rest of the sons of Jacob come to the city, question, Calvin?
What's circumcising?
What?
What's circumcising?
I can tell you later.
So, the innocence of children.
Not something I want to explain. But everybody else here understands what it is. All right, so they go in and kill all the men. Then when the rest of the brothers get there, and the family, they go in and they plunder the city. They take everything. The women, the children, they make them slaves, so on and so forth. Again, not supposed to do that. Not supposed to be mixed with the people of Canaan, even to have them as slaves or anything like that. And yet, so they go in and take everything. So now they have even more servants, and so on and so forth. But also, and Jacob is smart, because he says that, later on he says that you've made us stink and the people of Canaan, because if only through the power of God did the other cities around there not get together and come out and wipe them out. I mean, come on, they just murdered an entire city of people, of men. And then took the women and children as property. And it was only by the power of God that they didn't get wiped out. They really didn't think about what they were doing, when they did this, because they could have easily been killed. They're vastly outnumbered by these people. And they're strangers, Michael?
Can I ask you a kind of like a deep question? Okay, so why has this, ever since the beginning of time, people are fighting and killing each other? I mean, what is did God have a purpose in that? I mean, what was the purpose of all that? I don't understand.
So to answer your question, the question is, why has mankind always been fighting and killing themselves all the way back to Cain and Abel? It's part of humanity. And it's sin. Sin makes us greedy. Sin makes us jealous. And those are the things that drive us. Bible says we are slaves to sin. And most people don't really grasp that. In fact, one of the things that came home to me very clearly after I began being a pastor and really studying the Bible was, I was kind of raised in the church with this idea that we had free will. We had this huge amount of free will. Mm-hmm. What you find out is we actually don't. Right. You actually have one major choice in life: to follow God or not. If you choose not to follow God, the Bible says you're the slave of Satan. You don't have free will. You're going to do what Satan entices you and so on and so forth. He's in control. The only free will you get is if you give your life to Christ, which is funny because all the unsaved people think that's the loss of free will. Right. But that's not true. When we give our life to Christ and he allows us to be obedient or not be obedient, that's our choice. And we have free will, but it's limited free will. We have free will to a point. If God really wants you to do something, what's going to happen? Just ask Jonah and other people in the Bible that didn't want to do what God said. It's like, well, the easy way and the hard way, but you're going to do it. That type of thing. So in reality, we don't have much in the way of free will outside of giving our lives to Christ and then gaining the free will you find in God's community. But outside in the world, in fact, the way I used to prove it in a sermon was say, anybody here ever done something you absolutely knew was harmful to you and those around you, but you did it anyway? Everybody. Why? Because you don't have free will. That's why. Because if you had free will, would you have done it? No. But yet you did.
I lost that.
Okay? If you do things that you know are bad and painful for you and bad and painful for other people, something's driving you to do that. We don't do things that harm us.
What is that?
That is Satan and our sinful nature. Because the Bible says you're either a child of God or a slave of Satan and sin. And that's it. There is no in between. That's your two choices. And if we're not part of God's kingdom, we're a slave to sin and to Satan, who's the master of sin, who's, by the way, the creator of sin as well. And so we are then slaves. And that's a way to prove it. When we do things we know are bad for us and we do it anyway. That shows us we don't have the free will that we like to pretend that we have. So, we do have some limited free will out there in the world as being non-Christians, but still, most people are going to follow their sin nature and do what comes naturally. Not many people will fight those natural feelings. Okay?
This is probably going to be a weird question, but if God made that there could be no sin in heaven, how did Lucifer sin?
God didn't make it to where there'd be no sin in heaven.
Well, you can't sin.
No, it's just God, when we go to heaven, we'll be recreated in new bodies and so on and so forth, and our sin nature will be gone. But it's not that God said there can't be sin in heaven, because there was. Lucifer sinned and became Satan. But after he threw him out, all the rest of God's angels, all the rest of the inhabitants of heaven are 100% obedient to God, so there is no sin. And in heaven, once we get there, there'll be no Satan, no temptation. None of that will exist anymore. So therefore, there'll be no sin. Okay, let's see. We were at the idea of them killing and plundering of the city. Now, this is also fits into the fact that God made a promise to Israel, and it's in, I'll put it up here, Jeremiah 30:16. Remember I told you before, and we read it, where it says, everyone who blesses Abraham, meaning him and all his descendants, will be blessed. Everyone who curses them will be cursed. And we've looked at history, and you can see that is absolutely true. It has happened over and over and over and over, and the only explanation is God's intervention. There's another verse, and a couple actually. I pulled the one out of Jeremiah. It says, therefore all who devour you shall be devoured, and all your foes, every one of them, shall go into captivity. Those who plunder you shall be plundered, and all who prey on you I will make a prey. So God also promises them, if anyone attacks them and plunders them, attacks them and harms them, God will plunder them. God will harm them. And so here in Shechem, we see that playing out in that we don't like the way it happened, okay, because these guys committed tremendous sin in doing what they did. But nonetheless, they harmed Israel. And what happened to them? They were destroyed. Their city was plundered. What was their goal? To plunder Jacob's family. Remember, that's how we started out. We'll get all their stuff eventually. And then you turn around and they're the ones who got plundered. So it's still a fulfillment of that promise that God made to them. So, and then of course, as I said, Jacob gets very upset and says, you're going to make us stink to the inhabitants of the land, because if they decided to get together, they could wipe us out. But yet God had already told him that he would protect them. He would never let anything like that happen to them to wipe them out. So that's what he did. Because by all rights, in any normal situation, the people around them would have gotten together and wiped them out. You know, because you don't go into a city and murder all the men for no apparent reason. I mean, if you were looking from the outside in. Okay, so one woman got raped. You don't kill everybody. You might kill the guy that did it, you know, that type of thing. And especially since he wanted to marry her. You know, it wasn't just like he did this to her and walked away. He really wanted to marry her. Nonetheless, the others would get together and destroy them. But they don't, because God protects them. So that's chapter 34. Now we're going to go into chapter 35. You never thought I'd get to the chapter that quick, did you?
You're speeding right now.
So now what God does next, he sends Jacob back to Bethel. Remember? Bethel, that's where he saw the ladder and the angels ascending and descending and all that. He put his first marker up, his first stone. When he went there, God now tells him to make an altar there. He does so, and then he makes all of his servants give up their false gods. This is only the second time we've gotten any inkling that the servants that he has, who have come from other nations and such, have false gods. Because the only other inkling we've gotten was, remember, Rachel had stolen her family's gods, and Laban came looking for them. Because see, up to this point, we think that Jacob and everybody in his group, they all worship God, and all. That's not true. They all have their own gods. And this is the point where he formally tells them, give me all of your false gods. And they're his servants. They have no choice. So they give them to him. He takes them and buries them under an oak tree. And there must not have been many oaks, because in the Bible, they'll always give those kind of things, like they buried them under the oak tree in this area, which has to mean it's like the only tree, because otherwise they'd give you more directions. You know, but remember, large trees really didn't grow in Israel. There was a time where they had a lot of trees, but they weren't really more like the oaks and all that were good for lumber or things like that. And then over the years, as we talked about, as all the different armies came through, they cut all the trees down to make siege weapons and fires and so on and so forth, and actually changed the climate of the nation of Israel from one that was much more favorable to growing crops to one that's very dry like Arizona. And that's why I told you, I think last week, that they've had a plan in place ever since basically they came back into the land to replant the trees. And many, many years ago, they had planted over 20 million. And so that's their goal, is to try to plant enough trees to bring Israel back to the climate that it had a long time ago. So, anyway, let's see. Now,
that would be a good experiment then. If it worked, I mean, the whole world could.
Yeah, I don't know how effective it would be, because the climate in that whole area has changed. During the time when Israel was much better watered, when it was the, like as it says later, the land of milk and honey, where enormous plants growing stuff, the Sahara Desert was green. and was covered in grass. Yeah. And it was all ranch land and cattle. And there were actually some fairly large empires that grew out of that in Africa that don't really ever get talked about. But then the weather changes and it slowly gets drier, and the Sahara starts in the north. It begins creeping south as it gets drier and drier and drier. And again, we're back to what caused that. Global warming. Aha! We have actual evidence of this happening in the past that's overwhelming that happened. And so, because remember the Cushites, the ones who lived south of Egypt in what we now call Ethiopia and some other areas? Those areas are very desert today. But if you go back in their history, you'll find they had some large and powerful empires that were built on cattle because it was an enormous area of grass, all that's now the Sahara. And in fact, that's why at one time, this was only found out in the last, I think, 20 or 30 years, there was a time when there were black pharaohs in Egypt because the Cushites had gotten powerful enough to defeat the Egyptians in battle. The Egyptians usually made them slaves. They constantly defeated them and made them slaves. Well, they were powerful enough to defeat the Egyptians, and their black leaders took over. And they had built statues of themselves that showed black people. But then when the Egyptians finally, I think it was 60 or 70 years, defeated them and drove them out, guess what they did to all that? It was all chiseled off the buildings and all the statues were destroyed and buried. And that's why we didn't know about it until they were doing some digging at a site, and they all of a sudden found these statues of pharaohs that were clearly of the southern people, the Cushites. And at one time they were very powerful. Also, funny enough, the Cushites built pyramids. And their pyramids were older than the Egyptian pyramids, except they're much smaller. But they were people who built pyramids. And so archaeologists are now thinking that the Egyptians learned how to make pyramids from the Cushites. They just made them much larger. But yeah, it's very interesting. As you read history, what's just amazing is how different so many parts of the world were thousands of years ago, climate-wise. Dramatically different than they are today. I mean, just like up north of us, we've got the Painted Desert, and then we've got the Petrified Forest. A few thousand years ago, the Petrified Forest was a giant swamp.
Right.
That's just a few thousand years, and now it's one of the driest places in Arizona. I don't think it ever rains up there. But they grew enormous trees. That's just a few thousand years ago. That's how much it's changed. Because we always think it's always been like it is now, in our lives, or in one or two generations, that type of thing. So, all right. Now, what the Bible tells us in chapter 35 is that a terror from God fell on all the cities they passed. That is why they didn't come out and wipe out Jacob and his family. Because God supernaturally worked and made them scared to death of him. Okay? Unreasonably so. They haven't done anything yet to make people afraid of them, other than tricking the people of Shechem. But all you would say as a leader of your city is, well, I'm not falling for that trick, kind of thing. But God puts a terror on them. And he does this when we come forward, over 400 years, they come back to the land to take the land of Canaan. We find the same thing, where God makes a terror on the Canaanites. So in half the cases, they don't even fight. Or when they fight, they don't fight well. And the Israelites wipe them out. So, now, Deborah is Rebekah's nurse. I don't know if you remember her. We haven't mentioned her for a long time. She was the woman that took care of her since she was little in her family. And when she left to go marry, she went with her. And she now passes away. Because she was would have been an older woman to start with. She passes away. She's been with Rebekah since they left home. She dies and she was buried under an oak tree below Bethel. And so, now God officially changes Jacob's name to Israel. He also gives the promises he made to Abraham and Isaac to Jacob. Those promises have been spoken before on several different occasions to Jacob. But this is a time when God makes it extremely official and says, I am giving you these promises, they belong to you. So it's the same promise. He'll give him the land. He'll have uncountable descendants. A nation and company of nations will come from him, more than just the nation of Israel. Kings shall come from him. And that happens. We've got the kings of Israel that come from him. And then nations, in one instance, it's when the kingdom splits into two. There's two nations, the northern kingdom of Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah. That's why he says nations, not just a nation come from him. So he set up another pillar at Bethel. Now Bethel has two pillars. When he says pillar, that means he stands a rock up on it too. You know, not like how we think of a pillar. And an altar. So all this is there now. And this is a very, very spiritual place for them. So you've got an altar and two pillars, and that's why from that point forwards, it becomes a very holy site for Israel. The area of Bethel does. And it stays that way throughout their history. So now, Rachel now has her final child, Benjamin. Unfortunately, she dies in childbirth. She doesn't survive the birth of Benjamin. And she's buried in what becomes Bethlehem. That's where he puts her in a tomb where they are at that point in time. And then, and that tomb is still there. You can go visit it to this day. In fact, that's it right there. That's Rachel's tomb. And you know what happens in Israel? Every time something in the Bible says happened, they build a church on top of it.
Right.
Unfortunately.
Right.
And it becomes a holy place and all that kind of stuff. But that is Rachel's tomb. And then Jacob continues on to Hebron, where his father Isaac lives. Now remember, Rebekah was his mother, Jacob's mother. And it was her, Deborah, her nurse, that died. And so he goes to Isaac, Hebron, where Isaac lives, because he hasn't seen him in a very long time. He's been gone up getting his wife and his herds and his wealth and all of that from Laban. And then Isaac dies while he's in that area. And Isaac lives to be 180 years old. So he's one of the last people after the flood that lives to be really old. The ages begin to drop very quickly here until we get down to 100 or less. And but he lived, as the Bible likes to say, what does it say? Old and full of years. That's like a great compliment. You got to see your children and your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren. Right. So he gets to see Jacob and all of this. And then not long after, he passes away. And then Esau comes up, and Esau and Jacob bury him. And part of what that tells us also is that Jacob and Esau are still at peace. Esau hasn't changed his mind and wanted to kill him again. They're doing fine together because God made sure to make Esau wealthy as well.
So there's not many trees in Israel, right?
Not now, no.
Is there a reason why they don't plant trees?
Well, no, I said they have a program where they're planting millions of trees, and they've planted over 20 million so far.
Okay.
They've been doing that almost since they got the land back in 48.
Okay.
Yeah, because it used to be that Israel got winter rains that nobody else got. And that's why they could grow winter grain. And that is part of what made Israel fabulously wealthy later on, because usually winter is the time when people run out of food. But yet Israel could supply grain to other nations and so on. And that was a big part of how they developed enormous wealth. Besides being the crossroads of the world, where all the caravans came through and they all had to pay a tariff and taxes and so on and so forth. When Israel is left to its own devices and not being attacked by somebody, as you read through the Bible, you'll find in every case, it takes a very short period of time to where they're fabulously wealthy again. They can have some nation come in and strip them down to almost nothing. And then in a generation or two, if they have peace, they'll be back to being fabulously wealthy again. But it's because of where God put them at that point in time. They were at the crossroads where all the caravans came through, bringing spices and silk and all that kind of stuff. And they could charge tariffs and taxes and all that was added to the economy. They had winter rains. They could grow grains. And also, they were phenomenally productive lands. Remember when they went into the land, one cluster of grapes was so big it took 2 men to carry it.
Wow.
That type of thing. So, let's see. Now, we go to chapter 36. We're going to cover it very quickly because it's just a description of Esau and his family. He has 3 wives and 6 sons. Esau does. If you remember, Esau married 2 Canaanite women. And that was a huge no-no. And then he went and married a daughter of Ishmael thinking that would be good, and that's still a no-no. He didn't really improve his position. But we are told in chapter 36 that their possessions, his and Jacob's, are so great they can't stay in the same area. Their flocks and herds are too big. And that's part of the reason that Esau takes his family, crosses the Jordan, and goes to the land of Edom and takes it over. And it's called the land of Seir when he gets there, but after he takes it over, it becomes the land of Edom, which means red, because it has red cliffs, a lot like our area in Sedona and stuff. And so he takes it over. Remember, it's a very hilly country. It's not a good country for farming. It's good for pasturing. But if you remember what I told you, where they got a huge portion of their income was it had copper mines. And at that point in time, copper was worth more than gold, silver, because weapons, farming implements, it was the hardest metal they had. And so they took over. They didn't create the copper mines. They took them over and then expanded them, and it brought in huge amounts of income for them. And then the rest of the chapter of 36, it just lists his descendants to the first chiefs of the tribes that then populated the land of Edom. Unfortunately, they always treat Israel really horrible, and so they get cursed by God. And the land of Edom today is in what we call Jordan, right where it borders the land of Israel. And God says he'll wipe them out, and that's basically what he does. The Ammonites, the Moabites, and the Edomites, which are all the nations on the eastern side of the Jordan that are all related to Israel, treat them worse than any of the other peoples do. And because of that, God curses them and wipes them off the face of the earth. Because not only do they treat Israel terrible, but they're their direct relatives. They're their cousins and such. And yet, if anybody should treat them well, they should, and they don't. They side with the enemies of Israel all the time. Okay, chapter 37. We open this chapter when Joseph, remember, he's the firstborn of Rachel. Rachel only has Joseph and Benjamin. She dies in childbirth with Benjamin. And Joseph is her firstborn, and he is loved more than anybody else. And we open chapter 37 when he is 17 years old. So Joseph's 17, meaning all of his other brothers are quite a bit older than he is, and then there's Benjamin, who's a lot younger than he is. So, unfortunately, Jacob is no better than his father Isaac in that he plays favorites. That's a big problem we have in the family of Israel, is that they play favorites, and they are obvious about it. Now, what does he do? What does he make for Joseph? Coat of many colors, yeah. And we think that's a big deal. You got to remember, in their day, color was expensive. Dyes only came from plants and animals, and it took an enormous amount of them to make the dye. So to make a coat of multiple colors, it was probably also made of multiple fabrics as well, was a very, very, very expensive gift that he gave to a 17-year-old and ignored everybody else. So, of course, that makes his brothers just love Joseph to death.
Yeah, right.
Literally.
Rivalry.
And Joseph does not help matters at all. This is an idea of what his might have looked like. We have no idea what it looked like. But what we know is it was made of fine linen, fine materials, and that it was multicolored, which also would make it stand out dramatically amongst everybody else. So every time his brothers looked up, what'd they see? Dad likes him better than the rest of us.
Yeah, right.
Now, to make matters worse, Dad turns Joseph into like a manager and a tattletale, because he always sends. Joseph doesn't have to go out and stay with the herds like everybody else does. He goes out to check on them. Whoa, that makes the brothers love him even more, and then take a report to his dad. And he's honest, because he's a very righteous man. He's honest with his reports. So it just kind of goes, and then Joseph gets even dumber in this instance when he has his dreams. But unfortunately, he does tell the truth.
Has anything really changed?
No. No, that's what Solomon says.
Repeats.
Nothing changes, not when it comes to humans.
Wow.
It's been the same since the beginning. That's why it's funny when you hear non-Christians talk about how eventually man will evolve into some utopia, perfect state. It's like, well, we've been at this for thousands of years.
Yeah, right.
Not only have we not gotten better, we've gotten worse.
Yeah, right.
Because now we can commit crime across the entire world from our computer. That type of thing.
That is confusing, if you don't mind me asking. It's kind of confusing because supposedly, it talks. What I get from the Bible, what I get from being Christian, right? Sometimes you go through these troubles and stuff like that, right? And
Mhm.
actually, all things work out for good for those that love God, right? So we're learning something, right? Okay, so it's, I don't know, it's kind of weird. So to me, it's like I'm more dependent on God than, well, in the past 10, 15 years, I'm more dependent on God than anything else. But it's like, how perfect do we have to be?
Well, we're not going to be perfect, but God's going to mold us into the image of Christ. And He's constantly at work. And the older we get, the longer we've been a Christian, the more we should be relying on God in all things. Meaning we'll become more and more like Christ as we do that. So remember what I always tell you, you got the choice, the easy way or the hard way. We can do what God wants us to do right up front, or He'll have to get in there and work in our lives until we're willing to do what He wants us to do, or go, or whatever the case may be. Okay, here's Joseph's dreams. If you remember, he had these dreams where his first dream was that all these sheaves, these 11 sheaves of wheat, bowed down to his sheaf of wheat. Now, if Joseph was smart, what would he have done? Shut up. Absolutely. His brothers already can't stand him. And now he goes and tells them his dream, and they understand that they're the other sheaves, and they're all going to bow down to him. To make matters worse, he has another dream where there are 11 stars, the sun and the moon bow down to him. The sun and the moon are his mother and father. And then the 11, and he tells his father this, and even his father says, "Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you?" And the answer is, yes, they actually will. But you can see Jacob's going, "Are you kidding me?" Because he's basically saying he'll rise to a position above his father, which didn't happen in their culture. But they have no idea what's coming in the next months and years. And as we said, I would have kept these things to myself and just waited for God to bring them, true, not go telling everybody. But he's only 17.
Right.
We're not very smart when we're 17, that's for sure. So now they really hate him. And these are the men that had no problem murdering an entire city. So I'm not sure you'd want them to hate you. You'd want to get on their good side.
They don't look very friendly.
They're not. So now they're way out in the fields, probably several days away with the flocks. And guess what? And they're back in the area of Shechem. Jacob sends Joseph to check up on them. Wonderful. And they know that's why he's coming. He never has to go out in the fields and do the hard, dirty work. So they see him from afar because, of course, what do they recognize? Coat of many colors, absolutely. And so they see him coming, and then they start conspiring. And they say, "You know what? We're done. We're going to kill him. We're tired of this. We're just going to kill him." And so as he comes up, they're getting ready to just take his life. Because they can do this easily. We know they have no regard for life. Now, other reasons for them to hate Joseph is also the fact that he's very obedient to God, and he's very pious and righteous. We know that as we see his life later on. And they're not. And that also makes them hate him. He's the goody two-shoes. Those kinds of things. Because we see when he's in Egypt, how very righteous he is. And they're obviously not moral or righteous. So, at first they're going to murder him. And then tell their father, and it's easy to do, a fierce animal killed him. Because that happened. And all they had to do was get some blood, throw it on the thing, take it home, say, "Oh, Dad, on the way to see us, a lion got him." Which is funny. There's no lions in that area today, but there used to be. There used to be lions all over. Europe, Asia, Africa, all over. And we've killed most of them off. Guess what the number one sport of kings was? Hunting lions. And they actually brought them to extinction in these areas.
Like buffalo.
Yeah, kind of, yeah. Except there weren't near as many lions as there were buffalo. To this day, I still can't believe we killed that many buffalo.
Right. Exactly.
When you go and look at those pictures of the piles of skulls, you're like, oh my gosh. There were hundreds of millions of buffalo. Yes. And in a period of about 10 years, we reduced them so much that the Indians were starving to death because they couldn't get enough food. It's just amazing. We also wiped out the passenger pigeons. That was the ones in the east that they said when the settlers first came, if a flock took off, they'd literally darken the sky. And I'm like, through hunting, we killed that many of those birds, completely extinct. You know, it's amazing. So, all right. So now they're going to take him and kill him. And so, but then Reuben doesn't want him to die. So he convinces them to throw Joseph into a pit. Remember, he's the oldest, and he's got a little bit of a conscience, apparently. You know, because his intent is to come back and rescue him later and get him out of there. Now, when they say a pit, it's most likely a dry well, which, you know, it may still be very muddy in the bottom, a very unpleasant place to be. But they threw him down in this dry well. Well, then, fortunately, along comes a bunch of Ishmaelites. The descendants of Ishmael, which I told you before, are the Arabs, who became what we call the Bedouin Arabs, and they ran the great camel trains across Saudi Arabia in that area, and they come along as part of the caravan, and they're also slave traders at this point in time. And so they say, hey, instead of killing him, how about we make some money off it? You know, when you were little, so there are times you wish you could sell one of your brothers or sisters to somebody, you know, get rid of them and make a little money. So that's what they do. They sell them to the Ishmaelites, and they are on their way to Egypt. So now, all of this going on, what or who is causing it? God. This is part of God's plan. We read it and we go, well, that's awful, that's horrible, but it's like, but that's God's plan.
Yeah.
He's working out his plan to get him to Egypt and eventually make him the ruler of Egypt so that he can save his family. But it's a long, difficult process to get there.
That's kind of what I was saying before. It's like all things work out for good for those that love God, but the process is not always sweet and easy.
Right. And also when you use that scripture, make sure you quote the whole thing. All things work together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose. If you just quote the first half, it's like, well, God just works out everything the way you want it in your life because you're a Christian and you love God. That's not what it is. And a lot of people use it that way. But it says, called according to whose purpose?
God's purpose.
His,
Right.
not yours.
Right.
So therefore, he works things to the good according to his definition of good, which I've told you before, there's only one definition of good in the Bible. The things that are in agreement with God's will and purpose, word and will. Everything else is evil. So when it says God works all things to the good, it means he works all things according to his will and word in the lives of those called according to his purpose.
Yeah, and I got it. It's just that it's uncomfortable sometimes.
Oh, absolutely. But see, the reason I bring it up is because I hear that verse, I hear it used enormously, and they always leave off the part that's the most important. Called according to God's purpose.
Absolutely.
That's what God does when he's doing good. And his good is very different than ours. Because, you know, if we're honest, what's our good? That which benefits us, makes us comfortable, makes us happy, that's good.
Me.
Outside of that, that's evil. But that's not God's definition of good. It's, you know, it's all things that are according to his word and will. That's good. That's it. That's the only thing that comes under that heading. And that's why the Bible can say that no man is good. Because none of us can fully accomplish God's word and will. We get better at it as we get older, but we're always going to screw it up a little bit. And then we're not good. Doesn't mean we're not loved. It just means we can't say we are good. Even when they came up to Jesus and said, oh, good teacher, he said, why do you call me good? Only the Father is good.
Or even Jesus.
Yep. Now, he is the Father. In that whole Trinity thing we can't understand, but he was making a point. There's only one being in all of existence that's good, God. And that includes the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, but still. Okay, so, all right. So they sell them to the Ishmaelites, and they're on their way to Egypt, and they're carrying things like gum and balm and myrrh and spices. A lot of these things are the embalming. So guess why they're in Egypt? They're going to make a fortune selling this because they used enormous amounts of this stuff. And it all comes from south of Saudi Arabia, where the Queen of Sheba is from, way in the future from here. So let's see. So the next thing they do, they gotten rid of him. Next, they kill a goat, put the blood on Joseph's coat. Then they go home and tell their poor dad. You know, they're not thinking at all about what it's going to do to him. You know, your favorite son was killed by a wild beast. I mean, these are men with no conscience.
Yeah.
I mean, it's amazing to me. But you got to remember, though, they're great representatives of their entire time period. They had very different values than we have today, and life had very little meaning. Very little meaning. It was not that big a deal to kill someone. Do you know when life finally had great meaning? It wasn't until Jesus came on the earth and said that we were made in the image of God, so on and so forth, that gives us this enormous value that no other animal on the earth has. And then what happened? Evolution comes right behind all this and does what? Tries to undo all of that and say, no, we're just animals like the other animals. And again, that's why people of today's world are to the point where life doesn't have much value again. Because if you're just a cosmic accident, if you're no different except by luck than a goldfish or a mosquito, then what's the difference? And there really isn't any. If you've been indoctrinated from preschool through college, evolution is true, man's a cosmic accident, your life has no point, no purpose, no meaning, you also begin to understand why people are angry and frustrated.
Me.
All this stuff that happens in your life, just think, if all the things that happen in your life and you've had drilled into you since birth that it's just all random accidents. There's no point, there's no purpose, there's no end. You live, you die, you cease to exist, and that's it. And that's what the bulk of the people live with in the world.
This is a very big part of why everybody's going crazy lately.
Yes,
Really-
so it's all together. It's all wrapped together.
Wow.
So, but we're out of time. We'll